Covering up a prominent surgeon's fatal mistake seemed far too easy to the hospital board. Protecting their reputation mattered more than the truth, and they were more than willing to sacrifice an ordinary nurse to save themselves. The police already had handcuffs waiting. What none of them realized was that the woman they had chosen as their scapegoat was far from ordinary. The hunters would soon become the hunted. The rhythmic beeping of a heart monitor echoed through Trauma Bay 4, the sound serving as the only anchor to reality amid the controlled chaos of the emergency department. It was 2:15 a.m. at St. Jude Medical Center in Chicago. The overnight shift was always dangerous. Fatigue clouded judgment, tempers ran short, and the line between life and death grew dangerously thin. Alice Beckett stood quietly near the wall, her hands tucked into the pockets of her standard-issue blue scrubs. At first glance, she looked completely unremarkable. To her co-workers, Alice was simply a dependable 32-year-old float nurse. She never complained about extra shifts. She never participated in gossip. She worked hard, kept her head down, and blended seamlessly into the background. For the last 3 years, being invisible had been exactly what she wanted. Tonight, however, invisibility was an option. On the trauma table lay Senator David Caldwell, one of the most influential politicians in the country. His arrival had been kept secret. He had entered through a service entrance less than an hour earlier, surrounded by security personnel and sworn to secrecy by hospital administrators. The senator had complained of severe abdominal pain, unlike anything he had ever experienced. The physician overseeing his care was Dr. Harrison Reed, the hospital's celebrated chief of surgery. Reed's reputation was legendary. So was his ego. Dressed in an immaculate surgical gown, he moved through the room with the confidence of a man who believed mistakes happened only to other people. Unfortunately, tonight he was wrong. Very wrong. Alice studied the senator's pale skin, the beads of sweat forming across his forehead, and the subtle but steady decline in his blood pressure. Years of experience had taught her to recognize patterns others missed. Everything about the man's condition pointed to one terrifying conclusion: a leaking abdominal aortic aneurysm. The senator wasn't suffering from a gallbladder attack. He was bleeding to death internally. "Dr. Reed," Alice said calmly, "his systolic pressure is dropping. Heart rate is 130 and rising. This looks like an aneurysm. We need vascular control immediately." Reed turned toward her, his expression hardening. "Nurse Beckett," he snapped, "I don't need diagnostic advice from someone whose primary responsibility is changing dressings." Several residents lowered their eyes. No one dared challenge him. The ultrasound showed inflammation. Reed continued, "Prepare him for laparoscopic gallbladder surgery. Administer 20 milligrams of labetalol." Alice didn't move. "If you lower his blood pressure now, you'll remove his compensation," she warned. "He's already losing blood." For a brief moment, uncertainty flickered across Reed's face. Then pride took over. "Do it," he barked, "or I'll personally make sure you're unemployed before sunrise." The room fell silent. Alice stared at him. Then the monitor screamed. A sharp, continuous tone cut through the air. The senator's eyes rolled backward. His body jerked once, then went completely still. The cardiac rhythm dissolved into chaos before flattening into a deadly line. "Code blue," someone shouted. Instant panic erupted. Residents rushed forward. Nurses grabbed emergency equipment. Alarms echoed throughout the department, and Dr. Harrison Reed froze. The renowned surgeon stared at the monitor in horror. His hands trembled. His face turned pale. For several seconds, he simply stood there. "This can't be happening," he whispered. Then louder, "Get the defibrillator." Alice's voice cut through the chaos like a blade. "A defibrillator won't fix hemorrhagic shock." Something changed in her expression. The quiet nurse disappeared. What emerged in her place was cold, focused, and frighteningly decisive. Before anyone could react, Alice moved. She crossed the room with astonishing speed and shoved Reed aside. The surgeon stumbled backward into a tray of instruments, sending metal tools crashing onto the floor. "What are you doing?" he screamed. "Security. Get her away from him." Alice ignored every word. Time seemed to slow. Every movement became precise, calculated, purposeful. She seized a scalpel and a specialized vascular access kit. The staff watched in stunned disbelief. She wasn't preparing for routine CPR. She wasn't waiting for a surgical team. And she certainly wasn't asking permission, because she knew something they didn't. Chest compressions were useless when the circulatory system was nearly empty. The bleeding had to be controlled immediately. Without hesitation, she positioned herself beside the patient and made a precise incision near the femoral artery. Gasps filled the room. One resident nearly dropped a tray. "She's insane," Reed shouted. "She's mutilating a United States senator." Alice never looked up. Her concentration was absolute. The emergency room faded away. The bright hospital lights disappeared. The shouting voices became distant echoes. Suddenly, she wasn't in Chicago anymore. She was back inside a battered Black Hawk helicopter, flying over the mountains of Cunha Province. Blood covered the floor. Rotor blades thundered overhead. A wounded soldier fought for his life, while enemy fire lit the night sky. And Alice Beckett remembered exactly who she used to be. Using a rigid guide wire and a balloon catheter snatched from a nearby emergency cart, Alice moved with astonishing speed and precision. Her hands never trembled. Every motion was practiced, controlled, and deliberate. The stunned medical staff watched as she inserted the wire into Senator Caldwell's femoral artery and carefully advanced it upward through the vascular system. She had no fluoroscopy, no imaging guidance, no surgical team assisting her. Yet somehow she navigated the catheter with uncanny accuracy. Her target was the descending aorta. The procedure she was performing was an improvised resuscitative endovascular balloon occlusion of the aorta, REBOA for short. It was an advanced battlefield technique developed to control catastrophic internal bleeding when immediate surgery was impossible. Even among military medical personnel, only highly specialized providers received extensive training in its use. In a civilian trauma bay, it was almost unheard of. Alice reached the correct position and inflated the balloon. Instantly, blood flow below the blockage was restricted. The maneuver effectively bought time by preserving circulation to the brain and heart while slowing the internal hemorrhage that was rapidly killing the senator. "Activate massive transfusion protocol," Alice ordered. Her voice cut through the panic like a commander's. "Uncross-matched O-negative blood. Now." For a moment, nobody moved. Then the authority in her tone shattered the paralysis, gripping the room. Residents and nurses sprang into action. Blood products were rushed into the bay. For lines were checked. Monitors were adjusted. Everyone suddenly had a purpose. A second later, the flat line on the monitor twitched. One weak heartbeat, then another. The room held its breath. A third heartbeat followed. The rhythm slowly strengthened. Color began returning to the senator's face. Moments later, blood pressure readings started climbing from the brink of disaster. The impossible had happened. Alice Beckett had pulled a dying man back from the edge of death. Silence swept across the trauma bay. Only the steady beeping of the monitor remained. The sound was almost surreal. Dr. Harrison Reed stared at the screen in disbelief. The senator was alive. Against every expectation, he was alive. But Reed wasn't looking at a miracle. He was looking at the destruction of his reputation. He saw a malpractice investigation. He saw lawsuits. He saw questions he couldn't answer. Most of all, he saw a nurse who had exposed his catastrophic mistake in front of an entire medical team. "You," Reed whispered. His gloved hand shook as he pointed at Alice. "You are completely insane." Nobody responded. "You performed an unauthorized procedure," he continued. "You assaulted a patient. You acted outside every hospital policy and every legal boundary imaginable." Alice calmly secured the catheter in place. Her expression never changed. She removed her blood-stained gloves and dropped them into a biohazard container. The wet slap echoed through the room. Then she finally looked at him. "I kept him alive, Dr. Reed." Her voice was calm, almost gentle. "Now I suggest you scrub in and repair the ruptured aneurysm I just gave you time to reach." Reed's jaw tightened. Alice glanced at the monitor. "You have less than an hour before prolonged ischemia becomes a much larger problem." Without another word, she turned and walked toward the exit. Nobody tried to stop her. Nobody even spoke. The automatic door slid open, then closed behind her. As she disappeared into the hallway, Alice knew exactly what would happen next. Hospitals were institutions. Institutions protected themselves. And when powerful people made mistakes, someone else usually paid the price. 9 hours later, her prediction proved correct. At precisely 9 a.m., a nursing supervisor appeared at the break room doorway. Alice had spent the remainder of her shift quietly drinking stale coffee and completing documentation. She hadn't bothered changing clothes. The supervisor looked nervous. "Administration wants to see you." Alice set down her cup. "Of course they do." She rose from her chair, clipped her identification badge back onto her scrub top, and headed toward the executive wing. The boardroom was designed to make visitors feel small. Dark mahogany walls surrounded a massive glass conference table that overlooked the Chicago skyline. Every detail projected authority. Every detail projected power. When Alice entered, the heavy doors closed behind her with a dull thud. The room was already occupied. At the head of the table sat Evelyn Croft, the hospital's chief administrator. Croft lived for budgets, liability management, and public image. Human lives came somewhere lower on the list. To her right sat Dr. Reed. Gone was the frightened surgeon from the night before. His confidence had returned. So had his arrogance. On the opposite side of the table sat 2 Chicago police officers. Their expressions suggested they would rather be almost anywhere else. "Please sit down, Miss Beckett," Croft said coldly. Alice pulled out a chair and sat. Her posture remained relaxed. Her breathing remained steady. She briefly nodded to the officers before turning her attention to Reed. He immediately looked away. Croft opened a thick folder. "Ms. Beckett, we spent the morning reviewing the disastrous events that occurred in Trauma Bay 4. She folded her hands. "Senator Caldwell remains alive and stable in intensive care. However, your actions constitute what appears to be gross negligence and potentially criminal misconduct." Alice raised an eyebrow. "Criminal misconduct? Let's stop pretending." Reed interrupted sharply. He leaned forward across the table. "When the senator experienced a minor drop in blood pressure, you panicked." His voice dripped with contempt. "You assaulted an attending physician, seized surgical equipment, and performed a reckless experimental procedure on a United States senator." A smug smile spread across his face. "You nearly killed him." Alice allowed the silence to linger. It stretched across the boardroom like a tightening wire. She sat perfectly still, her hands folded in her lap, her expression completely neutral. There was no anger in her eyes, no frustration, no fear. Oddly, that seemed to unsettle Dr. Reed more than if she had started shouting. "A minor hypotensive episode," Alice repeated softly. The words hung in the air. "The senator coded because his abdominal aortic aneurysm ruptured. You misdiagnosed a catastrophic vascular emergency as acute cholecystitis." Reed's jaw tightened. "The telemetry records will show his blood pressure collapsed. The surgical findings will show extensive internal hemorrhaging. Every lab value, every scan, and every operative note will support exactly what happened." She leaned forward slightly. "I performed an emergency balloon occlusion to preserve blood flow to his heart and brain until definitive surgical repair could be performed. Nurses don't perform vascular balloon occlusions." Reed exploded. His palm slammed against the glass table. The sharp crack echoed through the room. "That procedure requires specialized training. You inserted a catheter into a major artery without authorization. That's practicing medicine without a license. It's reckless. It's criminal." The surgeon's face was turning red. For the first time since entering the room, he appeared genuinely emotional. Evelyn Croft calmly raised a hand. "That's enough, Dr. Reed." The administrator slid a thick stack of papers across the polished glass surface. A silver pen followed. The documents stopped directly in front of Alice. "Miss Beckett," Croft said smoothly, "let me explain how this is going to proceed." Alice glanced at the paperwork, but made no effort to touch it. The hospital is facing a potentially devastating public relations disaster. Senator Caldwell is a high-profile patient. The circumstances surrounding his treatment cannot become public. Croft folded her hands. The document before you is a formal admission of responsibility. It states that, due to fatigue and psychological stress, you suffered a temporary mental health crisis and interfered with the attending surgeon's efforts to save the patient. She smiled politely. It also contains a comprehensive non-disclosure agreement. And if I sign? Alice asked. Your employment will be terminated immediately. Croft's tone remained cold and professional. You will be reported to the state nursing board, and your license will almost certainly be revoked. The administrator paused. However, in exchange for your cooperation, St. Jude Medical Center will decline to pursue criminal charges. Alice raised an eyebrow. You mean I quietly disappear? Essentially. And if I don't sign? Croft sighed dramatically. The performance was almost theatrical. She gestured toward the two police officers seated near the end of the table. Then Dr. Reed files a formal assault complaint. The hospital pursues charges for reckless endangerment and unauthorized medical intervention. Officer Jenkins shifted uncomfortably. Croft continued anyway. You will be arrested today. You will leave this building in handcuffs. The senator's attorneys will sue you personally. Whatever remains of your career will be destroyed. The room became silent once more. Dr. Reed leaned back in his chair. A smug smile spread across his face. Everything was unfolding exactly as he wanted. The blame had been redirected. The hospital was protecting him. The nurse would take the fall. Sign it, Alice, Reed said softly. It's over. Alice looked down at the confession, then at the silver pen. Finally, she looked directly at Evelyn Croft. Miss Croft, she said calmly, do you know why I was able to perform that procedure in under a minute using improvised equipment? Croft frowned. I don't care. I think you should. The administrator's patience visibly thinned. Alice continued anyway. Before attempting to blackmail someone, it's usually wise to perform a thorough background investigation. Reed rolled his eyes. Oh, here we go. My nursing degree is genuine, Alice said. The employment records you reviewed are also genuine. She paused. But there is an 8-year gap between 2014 and 2022. Nobody spoke. Alice's gaze moved slowly around the table. If anyone had looked beyond the public records, you might have discovered where I actually spent those years. Enough, Reed snapped. He pointed toward the officers. Arrest her. Officer Jenkins hesitated. Something about Alice's composure bothered him. People facing prison usually looked scared. Alice looked patient, as though she were waiting for a scheduled appointment. Nevertheless, Jenkins stood and removed his handcuffs. Ma'am, he said, I'm going to need you to stand up and place your hands behind your back. Alice didn't move. Instead, she glanced toward the large wall clock mounted above the conference screen. 9:14 a.m. Right on schedule. I wouldn't do that, officer, she said politely. Jenkins frowned. Why not? Alice met his eyes. Because you don't have jurisdiction. A harsh laugh escaped Reed. Jurisdiction? The surgeon shook his head. You're a nurse, not a diplomat. He pointed angrily. Take her into custody. Jenkins stepped forward. His hand reached toward Alice's arm. He never made contact. The massive oak doors suddenly exploded inward. The impact slammed them against the walls with a crack that sounded disturbingly similar to a gunshot. Everyone jumped. Both police officers immediately turned toward the entrance. Their hands dropped to their holsters. Croft gasped. Reed stumbled backward out of his chair. A sharply dressed man in a charcoal suit strode into the room. His expression was hard as stone. A gold federal badge flashed in his hand. 4 heavily equipped agents followed close behind. Large yellow letters stretched across their tactical vests. FBI. But as more personnel entered behind them, it became clear that the Federal Bureau of Investigation wasn't the only agency interested in what had happened at St. Jude Medical Center. The boardroom erupted into stunned silence. Flanking the FBI agents were 2 imposing figures in immaculate military dress uniforms. Their rows of ribbons gleamed beneath the overhead lights, and the insignia of the Department of Defense shone brightly on their lapels. The atmosphere changed instantly. This was no longer a hospital disciplinary meeting. This was something far bigger. Everyone freeze. Hands away from your weapons. Step back from the table. The command came from the man in the charcoal suit. His voice wasn't loud, but it carried absolute authority. Officer Jenkins and his partner immediately complied. Years of law enforcement instinct told them they were no longer the highest authority in the room. Slowly, they raised their hands and stepped back. The suited agent walked directly toward the head of the conference table. He never looked at Alice. Not once. Meanwhile, Alice remained seated, calm and composed. For the first time that morning, a faint smile touched the corner of her lips. She had been expecting this. "I am Special Agent Thomas Briggs of the Federal Bureau of Investigation," the man announced. "I am operating under a joint federal task force in cooperation with the Department of Defense." He dropped a thick sealed manila folder onto the table. The packet landed directly on top of the confession document Croft had tried to force Alice to sign. The sharp smack echoed through the room. Evelyn Croft visibly flinched. "What is the meaning of this?" she demanded. Her voice lacked its earlier confidence. "You cannot simply storm into a private boardroom. We are conducting an internal personnel matter." Briggs turned toward her. His expression remained completely unreadable. "Your personnel matter is now a matter of national security, Miss Croft." The administrator's face turned pale. Agent Briggs shifted his attention toward Dr. Harrison Reed. The surgeon looked as though all the blood had drained from his body. Gone was the smug confidence. Gone was the arrogance. Only fear remained. "Dr. Reed," Briggs said. The room grew even quieter. The agent reached to his belt and removed a pair of federal handcuffs. Without breaking eye contact, he tossed them onto the table. The steel cuffs skidded across the glass with a harsh metallic scrape. "You are about to have a very bad day." Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Reed stared at the handcuffs. His mouth opened and closed twice before any words emerged. "This is absurd." His voice cracked. "I am the chief of surgery." He pointed toward Alice. "She's the one who assaulted a patient. She violated protocol, ignored medical authority, and performed an unauthorized procedure on a United States senator." The surgeon's fingers shook. "If anyone is being arrested, it should be her." Briggs remained unimpressed. Slowly, he unbuttoned his suit jacket. "We aren't here because of Nurse Beckett." The agent's gaze hardened. "We're here because evidence suggests the existence of a coordinated assassination attempt." The room froze. "And what?" Croft whispered. Briggs continued. "An assassination plot involving the attempted murder of Senator David Caldwell." The administrator stared in disbelief. "That's impossible." "No," another voice answered. "It's very possible." One of the military officers stepped forward. The man radiated command authority. Every movement was controlled, every step deliberate. His uniform carried decorations most soldiers spent entire careers trying to earn. The nameplate on his chest read Jace. He walked past the police officers, past the stunned administrator, past the trembling surgeon. Then he stopped directly in front of Alice. For several seconds, neither spoke. The room watched in complete confusion. Then Colonel Gregory Jace's stern expression softened. A rare smile appeared. "It is good to see you again, Captain Beckett." The title hit the room like an explosion. Captain, not nurse, not employee. Captain. The colonel raised his hand in a flawless military salute. Instantly, the tactical agents standing near the doorway snapped to attention. The reaction was automatic, professional, respectful. Alice slowly rose from her chair. The transformation was immediate. The exhausted hospital nurse vanished. Her shoulders straightened. Her posture sharpened. The quiet woman who spent her days blending into the background disappeared. In her place stood someone entirely different. Someone accustomed to command. Someone accustomed to danger. Someone who had spent years operating where mistakes cost lives. With effortless precision, she returned the salute. "Good to see you too, Colonel." Her voice remained calm, though I wish it were under better circumstances. "You and me both, Captain." Across the room, Evelyn Croft looked utterly lost. Her eyes darted between the military officer and Alice. "Captain," she whispered. Her voice trembled. "That can't be right." She pointed at Alice. "She's a float nurse. She's worked here for 3 years." Croft shook her head. "She stocks supplies. She covers staffing shortages. She works medical surgical floors." Agent Briggs opened the manila folder. Inside were dozens of documents stamped with bright red security markings. The words "top secret" appeared repeatedly across the pages. The administrator swallowed hard. Briggs removed a file and placed it on the table. "Your Human Resources Department conducted a standard civilian background investigation." He looked directly at Croft. "Unfortunately for you, Ms. Croft, Captain Alice Beckett's actual service record was never available through civilian channels." He paused, then slowly turned the file around, because most of it remains classified at the highest levels of the United States government. The silence that followed was absolute. Agent Briggs fixed Evelyn Croft with a look of open contempt. "Ms. Croft," he said, his voice cold, "your Human Resources Department saw exactly what we intended it to see." He opened the classified file and withdrew several redacted documents. One by one, he tossed them across the glass table. The papers slid to a stop in front of the stunned hospital board. "What you didn't see," Briggs continued, "is that Alice Beckett is a former captain in the United States Army." Croft stared blankly. Briggs wasn't finished. More specifically, Captain Beckett served as the lead trauma resuscitation specialist for a highly classified surgical support unit attached to Joint Special Operations Command. The room fell silent. Even the air seemed heavier. Over the course of her military career, she completed multiple deployments throughout Syria, Afghanistan, and Yemen. Another document hit the table. She has received the Distinguished Service Cross. A second document followed, and 2 silver stars. A third landed beside the others. Those awards were earned while performing life-saving medical interventions under direct enemy fire. Briggs looked directly at Dr. Reed. "To put it simply, Captain Beckett has forgotten more about trauma medicine than you are ever likely to learn." Reed gripped the edge of the conference table. His knuckles turned white. His breathing became shallow. "That's impossible," he whispered, then louder. "If she's some legendary military surgeon, why has she been working as a nurse in Chicago?" Before Briggs could answer, Colonel Gregory Jace stepped forward. The decorated officer folded his hands behind his back. 3 years ago, Captain Beckett's team was caught in a devastating explosion during an overseas operation. His voice softened slightly. Several people she cared deeply about were killed. The room listened. Afterward, she requested separation from active service. She wanted quiet life. No special treatment. No headlines. No more classified missions. Jace nodded toward Alice. She earned her nursing credentials honestly and chose to spend her time helping ordinary people. Alice remained silent. Her expression never changed. Briggs resumed speaking. That arrangement worked until 2 months ago. The FBI agent began pacing slowly around the table. Federal investigators intercepted communications indicating that Senator Caldwell was being targeted. Croft swallowed hard. Briggs continued. The senator had become involved in a major investigation involving defense contracts and government corruption. The agent stopped beside Reed. "We believed someone intended to eliminate him during his upcoming visit to Chicago." A nervous tremor ran through Reed's hands. "We also believe the conspiracy had assistants inside St. Jude Medical Center." The surgeon's face went pale. "So Colonel Jace contacted Captain Beckett." Briggs nodded toward Alice. "We quietly ensured she would be present when the senator arrived." The room suddenly understood. Everything. The scheduling. The secrecy. The federal response. It had all been deliberate. When Senator Caldwell was admitted, Briggs continued. Events unfolded exactly as intelligence suggested they might. Alice finally spoke. Her voice was calm, measured, precise. The gallbladder diagnosis wasn't a mistake. Every eye turned toward her. It was intentional. Reed visibly flinched. Alice stepped closer to the table. The senator displayed signs consistent with internal vascular compromise. The symptoms were subtle but obvious if you knew what to look for. She stared directly at Reed. "You recognized them?" "No," Reed whispered. You knew exactly what was happening. Alice's voice remained terrifyingly calm. The damage was designed to resemble a natural medical emergency. She folded her arms. A delayed rupture. A seemingly unavoidable catastrophe. The surgeon's breathing became faster. Sweat appeared across his forehead. You ordered medication that would worsen the situation. Alice didn't blink. You delayed definitive treatment. You have no proof. Reed snapped. The words came out too quickly, too desperately. You are inventing this. Am I? Alice asked quietly. Reed stumbled backward. His chair tipped over and crashed onto the floor. The sound echoed through the room. This is insane. His voice cracked. I'm a respected surgeon. Not anymore, Briggs said. The agent reached into his jacket. He withdrew a small encrypted recorder. Reed froze. For the first time, genuine terror appeared in his eyes. Briggs pressed a button. Static crackled through the room. Then a voice spoke. A familiar voice. I don't care how it's done. The recording continued. Just make sure he never wakes up. The board members stared in horror. Briggs allowed the audio to play. A second voice responded. Nervous, breathless, but unmistakable. Dr. Harrison Reed. What about the payment? The first voice answered immediately. For $1 million. Offshore transfer. Once the death certificate is signed. Silence. Then Reed's recorded voice spoke again. I'll write it up as a ruptured aneurysm. Several people in the room gasped. The recording continued. I'm chief of surgery. A nervous laugh followed. No one questions my reports. Click. The audio ended. The silence afterward felt almost physical. Briggs calmly lowered the recorder. That conversation was captured at 11:45 p.m. yesterday. The FBI agent looked directly at Reed. Several hours before Senator Caldwell arrived at this hospital. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. The truth sat in the center of the boardroom, like a live grenade. Officers Jenkins and Miller had quietly backed away from the conference table. Neither wanted to be anywhere near the disaster unfolding before them. The hospital board sat frozen. Evelyn Croft looked as though she might faint. And at the center of it all stood Dr. Harrison Reed. His empire had just collapsed. The only question remaining was how hard the fall was going to be. Evelyn Croft looked as though she might collapse. Only minutes earlier, she had sat at the head of the boardroom table with complete confidence, convinced she controlled every outcome. Now her carefully constructed world was unraveling in front of her eyes. The prestigious reputation of St. Jude Medical Center was crumbling. The hospital was no longer facing a simple malpractice controversy. It was becoming the center of a federal murder-for-hire investigation. Croft's hands trembled as she looked from Agent Briggs to Alice. Her voice cracked when she finally spoke. Captain Beckett. Alice. We didn't know. The desperation in her tone was unmistakable. We had no idea who Dr. Reed really was. The administration was deceived just like everyone else. Nobody responded. Croft swallowed hard. We're victims here too. Alice slowly reached across the table and picked up the document Croft had tried so desperately to force her to sign. The false confession. The paper that would have destroyed her career, her reputation, and her future. Sunlight streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows, illuminating the pages in her hands. Alice studied the document for a moment. Then she looked directly at Croft. No, the single word landed with surprising force. You weren't victims. Croft's expression faltered. You didn't care about finding the truth. Alice's voice remained calm. You cared about protecting the hospital. She held up the confession. When something went wrong, you didn't investigate. You didn't ask questions. You didn't examine evidence. The room remained silent. You simply looked for someone expendable. Alice glanced at the shredded remains of her civilian life, represented by the document. You needed a scapegoat. With deliberate precision, she tore the confession in half. Then she tore the halves again. Small pieces drifted onto the polished glass table like falling snow. The gesture was simple, yet somehow final. Agent Briggs stepped forward. Miss Croft, effective immediately. St. Jude Medical Center is under federal audit. Croft's face turned even paler. Briggs continued without emotion. The FBI will be reviewing financial records, communications, staffing decisions, procurement contracts, and patient documentation. He closed the classified file. If we discover evidence that anyone within hospital leadership knowingly ignored suspicious activity, additional charges will follow. The administrator lowered her gaze. For the first time in years, she had no response. Briggs turned toward the tactical agents standing near the wall. "Cuff him." The agents moved instantly. Dr. Harrison Reed barely had time to react. 1 second, he was standing frozen beside the conference table. The next, he was pinned against the wall. Federal handcuffs snapped around his wrists. The sharp metallic click echoed throughout the room. It was the same sound he had hoped Alice would hear earlier that morning. Now it belonged to him. "No." Reed struggled wildly. "This is wrong." His voice cracked into panic. "You can't do this to me." The arrogant surgeon was gone. In his place stood a frightened man, watching everything he had built collapse around him. "I want my attorney." "You'll get one," Briggs replied evenly. The agents pulled Reed toward the exit. His protests faded as he was dragged through the doorway. Seconds later, the heavy doors closed behind him. Silence returned. A collective breath seemed to escape the room. The threat was over. The conspiracy had been exposed. For the first time all day, nobody was arguing. Nobody was lying. Nobody was pretending. Colonel Gregory Jace turned toward Alice. His expression softened. "The senator is stable." Alice nodded. "The intensive care unit is secured by Department of Defense personnel. His condition continues to improve." A faint smile touched the colonel's face. "He is expected to make a full recovery." The room understood what that meant. Without Alice's intervention, there would have been no recovery, no investigation, no justice. Jace straightened slightly. "Your mission is complete, Captain." For several moments, Alice said nothing. Then she reached up and unclipped the plastic identification badge attached to her scrub top. The badge felt strangely light in her hand. 3 years. 3 years of anonymity. 3 years of ordinary shifts, long nights, and quiet work. 3 years pretending to be someone simpler than she truly was. She looked at the photograph. The smiling nurse. The invisible employee. The woman hiding from her past. Then she placed the badge gently on the conference table beside the torn confession. Evelyn Croft stared at it. "What happens now?" she asked quietly. Alice looked at her. There was no anger in her eyes. No resentment. Only exhaustion. And perhaps a little sadness. "Are you coming back?" Alice considered the question. Then she smiled faintly. "No, Evelyn." Her voice was soft. "I think my shift is finally over." Without another word, she turned toward the door. She didn't look back. Not at the boardroom. Not at the executives. Not at the life she had built for herself. Colonel Jace fell into step beside her. Agent Briggs joined them. Together, they walked through the hospital corridors. Staff members stopped what they were doing. Doctors, nurses, technicians, patients. Everyone watched in stunned silence as the quietest nurse in the building walked away, escorted by federal agents and military officers. Outside, the morning air was cool and sharp. Chicago stretched before her beneath a sky beginning to clear. Alice paused for a moment and drew a deep breath. Her cover was gone. Her peaceful life was over. The past she had spent years avoiding had finally caught up with her. Yet for the first time in a very long while, she felt free. A black armored SUV waited at the curb. As she climbed inside, a genuine smile crossed her face. She no longer had to hide. The ghost had stepped out of the shadows. And whatever came next, she would face it as herself.